Thank you, Julia. Thank you for that. And I hope that that quick activity there was able to get some of the blood flowing and to get some of you kind of who've been here since 9 a.m. Ready for our next event. So welcome, Dame Alison.
Thank you.
As a brief introduction, to those of you who don't know, and I'm sure many of you will know the work that Dame Alison has done. Dame Alison is the CEO of the Chartered College of Teaching. And in this role, Dame Alison advocates for the teaching profession, regularly bridging the gap between teachers and decision-making bodies in government. Her book, Learning Without Limits, which was published in 2004, has influenced the teaching and learning strategy of thousands of educators and students across the world, and clearly also Mary Myatt, who was mentioning Dame Alison's follow-up book, Assessment for Learning Without Limits, in the previous workshop. I myself am a regular reader of Impact, which is the monthly journal that Dame Alison and the Chartered College team publish to keep the education sector up to date with the latest research findings, development studies in this sector. And don't forget as well that alumni of the qualified tutor training programs are also invited to become professional members of the Chartered College, for which we are very grateful to Dame Alison and her team. But without further ado, I will hand over to Dame Alison Peacock today, who will be taking us through a session on the power of professional development communities.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I'm sorry you've had such a busy morning, but I'm going to tell you a story. And then when I've told you a story, we'll have some slides. Yeah, let me start with the story. So in your role as tutors, you are going to potentially work one-to-one with students. And I want to tell you about a time when I was asked to do exactly that. So I'd been a teacher, I'd been a secondary teacher, I'd been a primary teacher. I was taking a career break. My two daughters were very young, and I was standing in the playground of their school, and the head teacher of the school came bowling out, and she said to me, "Oh, Mrs. Peacock, you're a teacher, aren't you? You know Claudia, we've got Claudia in our school. Well, we've got some teaching hours for Claudia, 3 hours a week, and we don't want to waste any money on an advert. So we thought we'd ask you, would you be prepared to teach Claudia one-to-one? We need someone to teach her to read." Now, I'd seen Claudia. Claudia was a little girl, she was in year 2. She was in a wheelchair. She was non-verbal, and I remember thinking, oh my goodness, how am I going to do this? You know, I was doing a master's at the time, part-time at the University of Cambridge, and I was studying inclusion and early years. So I kind of felt I didn't really have an excuse. But the thought of working one-to-one with a child with disabilities, being able to teach them to read when she couldn't speak, was quite daunting, to be fair. And so I was kind of thinking, don't say yes, don't say yes, don't say yes. And then I said, well, that would be great. I would love to come and work with Claudia. So I began working with Claudia. Now, when I met Claudia, she had a teaching assistant, Juliet, who was Spanish. And Juliet was lovely. But Juliet had no status within the school whatsoever. So she was a teaching assistant. At that time in that school, teaching assistants weren't allowed in the staff room. So here we have a child who's nonverbal with a teaching assistant who has no voice within the school system. But Claudia herself was just full of life. So the first time I met her, you know, she was just like, she was so excited she'd got her own teacher. And never mind, her teacher wasn't sure what on earth she was going to be doing. She was delighted. She had her own teacher. Juliet had been teaching Claudia to sign. I didn't know how to sign. So essentially what we needed to do was, in Claudia learning to read, I needed to learn the sign language so that Claudia could sign language the words in the book, and then we could all communicate, if you see what I mean. She was a child who was just full of life. She was full of joy. So everything was either funny, and if it was funny, then this laugh would come from her tummy and just kind of like, everything was just amazing. Or she would be very insistent that she didn't agree with something, and she'd be like, oh, you know, she'd let you know she didn't agree with something. And the other sign that she used quite regularly with a sort of sound was why, sort of to ask why were things happening. And it's amazing what you can communicate by sort of letting people that you know that you agree or you disagree, or ask them why. Anyway, we began to work together. Now in this school, she was in a year 2 classroom, and I was going to be working with her individually, but I wanted to work with her in the classroom. I didn't want to be taking her out. And the only time we would leave the classroom was to go and change her book, because all of the reading books, for some particular reason, were all stored at the end of the corridor of this school. There's a great long corridor. All of the classrooms had windows looking out onto the corridor. And so we would come out of the year 2 classroom, and Claudia would be in her wheelchair, I'd be one side, Juliet would be the other side, and we would go along the corridor laughing and joking, and then she'd choose her next book, and then we would come back, because as you know, when you're learning to read, choosing the next book is a really important part of the whole process. Anyway, as she began to learn to read, she became more confident, and as she became more confident, she became more noticed within the school. So on the playground at lunchtimes, for example, she would be parked up, she'd be sitting there, and then children would come to her, and increasingly they would bring their problems to her. So they'd say, Claudia, it's not fair. And she might say, what? And they would tell her what was happening, they would explain what was going on, she would listen intently, she would laugh with them, she would empathize with them. And then typically they would skip away happy. Because as you know, if you've got a problem and you go to somebody and they listen intently to you, but they don't spend their time talking, they don't spend their time saying, oh, you've just reminded me of something that happened to me, but just spend their time really listening, that's exactly what you need. So Claudia became incredibly popular throughout the school. She was, when she came back from Great Ormond Street the next time, she came and she had a frame. So she didn't have her wheelchair anymore, she had her frame, and we would go down the corridors and she would be on her frame, and we would laugh and joke, and we would go and collect the next book. Until the day came when it was time to go and choose her next book, and she stood up, and then she just kind of motioned to sort of push the frame to one side. And she took a step on her own. And then she took another step on her own. And all the children in the year 2 classroom looked up and saw what was happening and just burst into a spontaneous round of applause for Claudia. And we came out of the door of the classroom. And as we came along the corridor, the children in the next class looked out, and they could hear the applause from the classroom before. And they began to applaud because there was their friend walking, until we reached the end of the corridor with the whole school applauding Claudia. Now, I get emotional when I tell that story because it's just so fantastic. If we can have the slides, I'll show you a picture of Claudia. So if we can get the slides, thank you. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So here she is. This is Claudia in year 7. Now, the point of this story is not to say, oh, the great Alison Peacock got Claudia to walk. It's not to do with that. This is to do with what's possible when a child believes that you believe in them. And as tutors, this is the very special role that you have. You have the opportunity to create a bridge. You have the opportunity to enable a child to be noticed, to be listened to be recognized. This is a really amazing opportunity for you. No pressure. I mean, there is a bit of pressure because that was the kind of feeling that I had when I was like, can you teach Claudia to learn to read? I had no idea whether I was going to teach her to read. No one had been able to assess her previously because she hadn't been able to engage in the normal routine assessments. She had, I think, been labelled. She'd been labelled by the school as a child who couldn't. And because she wasn't disruptive, she was parked in the classroom with her teaching assistant, who also wasn't disruptive. And so there was a sense of, well, that'll be good enough. If we can move to the next slide, please. So in these books around Learning Without Limits, this is the research that I was involved in. The first book, the Red Book, was published at the turn of the millennium. And this book is about challenging the notion that fixed ability and notions of fixed ability are acceptable. So back in the day, it was quite routine for youngsters to be labelled in terms of their so-called ability. They would be potentially grouped by ability, put onto tables with sort of low-level tasks for some children, higher-level tasks for other children. And this book is really challenging this notion that we can reliably, or indeed that we should, look at children in this way. So keeping the whole environment open all the time to possibility is exactly what this is about. The middle book, Creating Learning Without Limits, is the story of what happened when I moved from being a classroom teacher to being a head teacher in a school that was labelled. It was a school that had been defined as being in special measures. It hadn't made any progress for 3 years. So all of the HMI, termly HMI reports had all been static for 3 years. And then I moved there as the head teacher. Through taking a Learning Without Limits approach, within the first year of me being the head teacher, the school was in the top 100 most improved schools. And within 3 years of me arriving as a head teacher, the school was judged to be outstanding. And then the third book, Assessment for Learning Without Limits, looks at assessment practices within primary and secondary schools that transform learning capacity, that seek to not set a limit, not to label, to be able to keep the door open, to constantly being encouraged, encouraging children to challenge themselves. So this is about making sure that the curriculum, this is what you will have heard about, it's from Mary Myatt, it's about making sure that the curriculum is low threat but high challenge, so that youngsters can constantly say, well, I can do this and I can do this and now I can do this. And oh my goodness, guess what I did today? Now I can do this. If we can have the next slide, please. So this notion of transforming learning capacity, there's quite a lot on this slide, but effectively it's about what you can do as a tutor to make sure that you are focusing on removing limits. So making sure that you are looking to lift limits and to build a kind of sense of competency in the affective, social, and intellectual domain. So creating a sense of openness about what may be learnt, an openness to ideas, to possibilities, to being surprised, not believing that there's one right way, not believing that there's the outcomes are all predictable, allowing the child to surprise you with what they're capable of doing, being open to questioning, restlessness, humility, as opposed to relying on ready-made certainties, ready-made solutions, offering inventiveness in the ways that you approach the learning with the young person. So being creative, being able to constantly seek to find a way through, not just complying with imposed models and materials, being persistent, being able to offer courage, humility, as opposed to just settling for easy answers and rejecting complexity. Offering the young person emotional stability. You know, if they feel safe with you, then they're able to take risks. They're able to resist all of the challenges, and they can come over, they can overcome a fear of failure and overcome a fear of trying new things. Again, as a tutor, you need to be generous, to welcome difference. This is really important. It's really about making sure that you understand that every child that you work with is unique. So this removes the kind of desire for uniformity, and it removes a deficit thinking model. And finally, being able to show empathy. So being able to offer supportiveness as opposed to encouraging a sort of sense of blame for where the child is. All of these things are really fundamental. So if we can have the next slide. Essentially, this is about shifting the culture. So if the children that you're working with have a sense that they're stuck, that they're behind, that they are failing in some way, and if you unconsciously reinforce this, then essentially you're saying, well, yeah, everything's stuck, everything's fixed, this is how it's going to be. Or, and this is where you've got a huge responsibility, or you believe in the art of the possible. You offer an opportunity for this child to really flourish, to be able to overcome their current difficulties, to be able to achieve understanding, to build self-efficacy, to build self-worth. Now, another story for you. So when I first started at that school, I'd only been there a number of weeks, and a parent came in to see me and she said to me, Mrs. Peacock, this school thinks my daughter's stupid. So I sort of said, sort of tell me, Mrs. Learning Without Limits, what's this all about? Yeah, well, this school thinks my daughter's stupid. She's in year 4, and the teacher just thinks she's not capable of doing anything, and she's just not being given enough challenge, and she's just not achieving. And I know she's capable of so much. So I went to see this child and to see what was going on in year 4, and I have to say, of all the teachers in the school, every teacher stayed except the teacher in year 4, because the teacher in year 4, frankly, didn't like children. And I see this as a drawback. I don't know about you, but I find this quite a drawback. So she didn't like children. And when I went into that classroom, the children were all grouped by ability. They all had labels on their tables. So they had sort of stands like you might have in a restaurant with a label on it. And this particular table where this little girl, Rebecca, was sitting was labeled the full stops. So this is an English lesson, and she was a full stop, so she was going nowhere. And the rest of the groups were labelled with different things, reaching the dizzying heights of the exclamation marks. But essentially, if you were on the full stops table, you were going to be given work that wasn't challenging, wasn't stretching, didn't expect very much from you. And yeah, absolutely going nowhere, as Julia says. Now, that teacher needed to move on. She moved on after the school came out of special measures. So we came off special measures in the October as I joined in the January. By the December, the teacher had been offered another job, and the head teacher said to me, would you be prepared to release her early? And I said, yes, even though I hadn't got a teacher to take her place, I knew that was going to be an improvement. Anyway, what subsequently happened was that our deputy head, Simon, was appointed, and he took this class, the class that Rebecca was in year 5 and in year 6. He was a wonderful teacher. He's a head teacher now in Barnet, a very wonderful teacher, very inclusive, very knowledgeable about the curriculum, inspired the children. If we can have the next slide, please, because then we can see Rebecca. This is what she achieved. So she went from being a full stop to being a child who flourished in year 5 and 6 with Simon, who then went on to her secondary school, and at Imperial College London was judged to be Young Engineer of the Year. So again, a hugely transformative trajectory. Had she had that teacher, or a teacher equivalent to that teacher in year 4 for year 5 and year 6, the chances are she wouldn't have been given the chance to achieve. She wouldn't have been given the chance to show what she was capable of. So when it came to the SATs, she wouldn't have been able to achieve very highly because of the diet that she'd been offered. And then when she went to her secondary school, because they judged the attainment on the SATs results and were grouped accordingly, she wouldn't have been able necessarily to have achieved in her secondary school. So every moment that we have with the children that we teach is vitally important. Every moment, every opportunity that we can find makes a difference. The tutoring hours that you do with the young people that you work with could unlock the key to make that difference, particularly if you're able to work in partnership with the school. And I would very much hope that that's something that is becoming much more common, but certainly unlocking the key for the young person is absolutely fundamental. If we can have the next slide, please. Post the pandemic, we've seen how children have just needed connection. We've all needed connection. It's not just children. We've all needed to be back socializing, not just sitting on Zoom from our dining rooms talking to conferences. But never mind, we are where we are. But children particularly thrive on social connection. And we've known that has been absolutely fundamental to the coming back of schools. They will also thrive on the connection they have with you, because it's an opportunity to work either in a small group or to work one-to-one. It's an opportunity to be noticed, an opportunity to be listened to, an opportunity to be really valued. It's not just about transmission. You know, the tutoring role is not just about what can you open up the top of their head metaphorically and pour in the time that you've got. Of course, you want them to be gaining knowledge, you want them to be recovering certain areas of learning and going over ideas and consolidating ideas, but it's not just about talking at them, it is about connection. And the more you create a connection with the young person or the young people that you're working with, the greater the opportunity to enable them to learn. You want them to be in a position where they want to please you, where they want to do their best, and where everything that you're doing is done in harness. Because the opposite of that is a very difficult relationship. If you've got youngsters who really don't want to be learning with you, who are resistant to the kinds of things that you're suggesting, then that's a very challenging situation. And, you know, it's actually really difficult teaching in a very small group or teaching one-to-one, because there's no hiding place. There's no hiding place for the young person, but there's no hiding place for you either. So it's a very intense relationship. You need to make sure it's a positive one. Really, really positive. Really building on the opportunities that you can have together. So it is about knowing each other and listening as well as just talking. If I can have the next slide. One of the things that has been spoken about a lot is the need for catch up at this time, the need for sort of, come on, we just got to get them in, get them on, pick up on all the things that we haven't done. The reality is we can't regain lost time. It would be wonderful if we could, but we can't. So it's really foundational that you actually focus on the key areas of learning for the subjects that you are teaching. Really trying to make sure that the foundations have been understood. And then trying to see if there are ways in which, through your tuition, there are ways in which you can encourage the youngster to be doing other things in their own time. So are there lessons that they can look at online? Can they access Oak National Academy, for example? Can they go and see some of the facilities that are available online in museums, in galleries, in all kinds of ways to supplement their learning they have with you? Because they will have plenty of other time. It's just how they choose to spend it. And really, again, one of the things that's really important is reading fluency. So if you're able to inspire through part of your tuition a love of a particular book or a series of books, you know, reading for pleasure, these things make a massive difference to the attainment of youngsters. So again, I would encourage you to really look at the breadth of the curriculum and to encourage some learning beyond the tuition that enables flipped or blended learning. So it could be that you're saying, well, next time we meet, we're going to be covering this. You might want to look up about this particular area of whichever subject it is that you're teaching, so that you're building a kind of expectation that this is a process that is going to be lifelong, but is certainly a process that's not just going to be related to the one session or the amount of time that you have. If I can have the next slide, please. Now, obviously, you've got a limited amount of time with the youngsters that you're working with. You're going to need to make sure that you offer clear explanation, that you can scaffold their learning. And what I mean by this is to give them enough challenge so that they're excited by the task, but not so much challenge that it's eye-watering and they don't know where to start. So scaffolding the learning, scaffolding the process, giving them the prompts they need, whilst also enabling them to think for themselves. And giving them feedback all the time. So that formative feedback that enables them to see where they're doing things in a way that's really going in the right direction, but where also they may need to develop their thinking. So this is, again, it's the basics of really high quality teaching, but you've got it in an intense situation with your young person. So constantly making sure that that cycle of explanation, scaffolding, feedback is a part of every lesson. I would really recommend to you. Now, in the situation that you're placed in the tuition situation, you have an opportunity to look beyond the surface. So if we can have the next slide. Now, I'm not sure how clear this is to you, but this is a piece of writing that was done by a 7-year-old child. And the writing says, "In my world, I read books and I think." The end. Now, I was sent this piece of writing by a professor from the States. And when I received it, I kind of scanned through the document. I saw the child was 7 years old and I thought, well, come on. What, I mean, am I supposed to be impressed? I mean, okay, it's spelt correctly, but, there's quite a lot to be desired. It's not even joined up writing. There's a whole load of this paper has been taken up with pictures. I'm not quite sure what these pictures are all about. Yeah, go on then, impress me. So I then looked at the dialogue that had taken place between the teacher and the child. So the child has produced this, and the teacher says, "What's going on in this story, Clamerly? In my world, I read books and think. What is it a picture of? Two people are thinking the same book about the same pig, but it doesn't have the same title, but it has the same pig. But the pig is just standing up at the sun, and the other one is, I think it's eating food at the farm. The two people are happy because they always wanted to have the same book and the same brain connected." The same brain connected. So what are they holding in their hands? Books. Those are the books themselves. Are they reading together or talking about the books? Thinking. How are they connecting their two brains? By reading the same books about pigs. How did you get an idea for making this? Is it a picture or a story? Story. It's a story. And are the two people sharing? They're sharing their brains while they're thinking it. The two brains are being shared. How does that happen? By connecting books and brains. Do you like connecting books and brains? Kind of. Why? Because I love reading. Reading is important in your life, and your brain likes books. So when I read that dialogue between the teacher and the child, I realise that the child at 7 years old philosophically has grasped the fact that if I'm reading a book with the same character in it and you're reading a book with the same character but it's a different story, we are sharing our brains, we are sharing intelligence about that particular character. Now, for me, that is pretty phenomenal. But I would never have known that by just looking at that page of writing. I would never have guessed any of that insight. This is where, as a tutor, you have that special opportunity, because you have the opportunity not only to look at the writing, but to interrogate and to understand and to ask. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that every time you ask a child about a picture they've drawn or a piece of writing they've done, they're going to be able to give you the kind of insight that we've got there from Clammerly. That was clearly exceptional. That's why a professor wrote to me in England and sent it to me. And that's why I'm sharing it with you today. But every piece of writing belies so much more thinking. And you have the opportunity in the role that you have as tutor to understand some of that thinking. You really do have the opportunity to go beneath what is written on the page. I can have the next slide, please. I believe that we need to be compassionate teachers, particularly at the moment, particularly in the pandemic, particularly when we think about what everyone has been through. So it's not a waste of time to establish the connection and to make sure that you are listening. Of course, you don't want to spend the whole hour listening to stories about what happened at the football. But on the other hand, an opportunity to make sure that you're connecting and listening is really good. And to appreciate all that's being offered. And to do this in a spirit of hope. So your positivity is really fundamental here. Whatever the young person is saying to you or doing, you constantly come back and position it in a sense of partnership, of shared ambition, of positivity, of hope for the future, of can do, of we're going to find a way through, we're going to help you, you're going to achieve, you're going to get better, you're going to improve. Absolutely fundamental to absolutely everything that you're doing. If I can have the next slide, please. But there's also something about you and making sure that you are looking after yourself. If you feel stressed or anxious, that will come across. If you feel like you're underprepared, if you've been too busy, if you suddenly sit down, here we are at a tutor session, you haven't really thought through what you're going to do, that will come across. But also you need to be aware of the fact that if your young person or your young people that you're working with are anxious, then you will hold that anxiety. They will transfer that anxiety to you. So it's really about making sure that you are just aware of this. So the mood that you're in, the way that you communicate will impact the child, but also the anxiety that the child has will impact on you. So it's about making sure that following the sessions, you have a way of decompressing, whether that's going for a walk or just having a cup of tea or discussing something with your partner or someone else that you know, just to make sure that you allow yourself a bit of space. Because it may well be that the young person that you're working with has suffered loss. And so many people have during the pandemic. So being aware of what's happened within the community, being aware of what's going on, not just sort of brushing over these things, it's really important because you may well be the person that they do ultimately connect with more than anyone else. So they need to know that you care, and they need to understand that when they tell you things, that you're going to listen. Okay, can we move on to the next slide, please? So I was a head teacher for many years in that school that I told you about, it kept on getting judgments of outstanding, and the more that you get judgments of outstanding and you've written about somewhere and can talk about it and use it as a model of hope for other schools, the more that schools will listen and the more that teachers will listen. And so I began to work nationally. I worked with the government, worked with the DFE, and then an opportunity arose in 2016 to apply to become the chief executive of the Chartered College of Teaching. So the Chartered College is a new professional body that exists to build the expertise of teachers, all teachers, including yourselves. And one of the things that we do is we produce a journal, as you've heard. We have a website that is full of information, that has research digest, but also has original research. So it's got the huge database that is the same database that you would have access to if you were doing a master's or a PhD in education. that professional body is really about connecting, supporting, inspiring teachers, and building the status of our profession. So I really would recommend it to you, and it's available to you as a professional affiliate or as a full member if you are a qualified teacher. But if you're not, then as a professional affiliate, and all of the benefits of that website and the journal and everything else are available to you. I can move on to the next slide, please. I do think that during the pandemic, there were many things that made us stop and think. You know, that expression about stop the world, I want to get off. Well, kind of that is what happened, wasn't it? You know, the world did stop. We all just had a chance to take stock. And it was a frightening time, and it's still ongoing. The fact that potentially we were going to lose members of our family was a horrific circumstance. And yet we sort of, as a profession, we kind of felt that we just needed to get on with it. Now, I do think that the parents have a greater appreciation of our profession, having sat in the back of a virtual classroom. Some teachers, I think, feeling they were teaching not only 30 children, but also 30 sets of parents as well on a regular basis. I feel as though the profession has a greater understanding from society. There's something about the fact that we've all been through the same situation that means that a global connection feels much more positive, but also much more possible, and that we have things to learn from each other all across the world about how we teach effectively, how we engage with young people remotely, what do we do about young people who haven't been able to sit formal assessments, how do we learn from each other. Thinking about the accountability of schools and just trying to get that into context, and perhaps being less driven by outstanding labels and more driven by doing what we need to do for our young people. And alternative assessment options are also being discussed. And then the whole notion of the world in which we live, and thinking about sustainability and so on. You know, the young people that you're working with will be thinking about all of these things and will be motivated by all of these things. They may well be worried about their future exam success. They may well be worried about the future of the planet. They may well be worried about whether they can be employed and what their future employment will look like. All of these things are real, and they're much more tangible than perhaps they were prior to the pandemic. Now, if we can move on to the next slide. I really believe that as a tutor, you are a dealer in hope. You're someone who is there to try and make the difference. So again, it's lunchtime, so we'll have another story. And this is a story of a little boy. I've called him Miles because it's miles away from his real name. But anyway, I first met Miles when he came across to my school. He was 3 years old. He had been put in an emergency foster care placement. His foster mother brought him over to the school and she said, "Oh, I'd like to put Miles's name down for nursery." And we went and stood in the nursery, and he was sort of clinging very tightly to her hand. He'd been strapped in his pushchair or left in his cot. He had very poor mobility. He couldn't speak. He wasn't toilet trained. But he broke away from foster mother's hands as we're standing in the nursery, and he kind of toddled like this through the door into the foundation stage garden. And there was a little boy sitting in a little Tykes car, and Miles just put his hand into the window of the car and just stroked the hair of the little boy that was in the car, and the boy got out, and then he dived headfirst into the car. And then he came out of the car and sort of flung himself into the playhouse. And then there was the sand and the water and the bikes and the trikes. And it was, you know, that expression, a child in a sweet shop. I was just, here were other children, toys. I mean, it was just amazing to him. And I said to the foster mother, "Look, let's just bring him into school tomorrow." He wasn't actually supposed to start school for another term, but he came to us, he came into nursery straight away, and we provided a full-time teaching assistant to work alongside him. He was echolalic, so as he began to learn to speak, he would repeat the last thing that the teacher had said. So he became like the class policeman. So when she would say things like, time to tidy away Play-Doh, he'd say, tidy away Play-Doh. He was in nursery longer than the other children because he'd started early, and then he went into our reception class. It was a foundation stage unit, so he was with us for over 2 years. He began to start to learn some of his phonics, but he was very distracted all the time because he had a series of ritualized behaviors. And one of these ritualized behaviors was that if an adult came into the classroom, and they quite often did because it was a thoroughfare through into year one, if an adult came into the classroom, he felt compelled to rush up to them and stop them and ask them about their mummy. So he'd say, you know, where is your mummy today? How is your mummy today? Even the chief inspector of schools who came to visit our school had to stop and tell Miles about her mummy before she was allowed to go through the classroom. It got to the end of the reception year, and there was a case conference, and the educational psychologist and the social worker and foster mother and teachers and all of us got together, and the decision was taken that Miles should go to special school because the feeling was that he wasn't able to focus and that he was constantly having his learning disrupted through all these ritualized behaviors. And I was very sad about this because here was I, Mrs. Learning Without Limits. You know, I really wanted Miles to stay with us in the school, but the decision was taken that he move. And anyway, so roll on a few years, at the beginning of year 5, the phone rang and it was the special school, and they said, oh, hello, Mrs. Peacock, Miles is ready to come back now. And I sort of said, well, really? I mean, I'd got the Miles in my head who was sort of slathering everything and kind of echolalic and not able to focus. And I was like, really? I mean, is he going to be able to cope in year 5? And they said, oh, yes, we think he needs to come back. So he came back to our school, and in year 5, he remembered some of the children, they remembered him. He settled back in. He was very sort of contained, but you know, he was able to pick up. And in year 6, he went on school journey. He took part in the school plays. And at the end of year 6, when the children did their SATs, I was absolutely amazed. And this is me, you know, I'm saying we should never label children. We shouldn't predetermine what they're capable of. We should always keep an open mind. I was absolutely amazed when Miles achieved level 5s in all of his SATs. Now, he then moved on to secondary school because he was a looked after child. His foster mum had subsequently adopted him. He was a looked after child. He went on to the secondary school and continued to do really well. And on the day that I was leaving my school as head teacher, it was Christmas and we had an assembly, and I was determined that this was going to be a very upbeat kind of assembly. Nobody wants a head teacher crying all over the place. So anyway, we did this assembly, and it was goodbye, Mrs. Peacock, and I was like, goodbye, and it's all going to be fine and everything's great. And then I went to my office, and there on my desk was a letter from Miles. I'm not going to read it to you because I will cry, but essentially it says thank you, and thank you for believing in me, and you're going to go on to great things. I've just recently, in the last fortnight, found out that Miles has been accepted by a Russell Group university to go and study. Now, again, this is a story about allowing children to surprise you, about high quality teaching, both from the nursery and reception teachers, from the special school, from the remainder of primary, from secondary, from the huge contribution that the family makes. Really importantly, Miles himself. You know, Miles had to overcome so much to get to where he is now. And he must have built a sense of self-worth, a sense of can do. He's been surrounded by people who've enabled him to believe in himself, enabled him to take the next steps, enabled him to be successful. So there's another story for you. Just very quickly, another slide just to say, if you want to join the Chartered College, it's cheap. It's less than £4 a month. I don't know, it's something like £3.89 or something. But do join us. And then a final slide, if we can just have the last slide, please. Just to say that teachers make the weather. Tutors make the weather. You know, if at the start of your session, it feels as if it's pouring with rain, you can be the sunshine. You can be the one that makes the difference. You know, you have that opportunity. So I've got a quote from a teacher. He says, "I have come to the frightening conclusion I am the decisive element in the classroom. It is my personal approach that creates the climate. It is my daily mood that makes the weather. As a teacher, I possess tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humour, hurt or heal. In all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated, a child humanised or dehumanised." You have that power as a tutor. So I'm wishing you sunshine in all of your sessions. And I'm hoping very much that this is an enjoyable experience for you, an enjoyable experience for the young people that you're working with, a powerful experience that makes all the difference, an experience that transforms lives. Thank you very much.
Alison, thank you.
You can't really do clapping on Zoom, but if we could.
No, but I tell you what we can do. Ludo, can you make a quick answer garden, please, as a gift to Alison?
Mrs. Peacock.
I'm sorry, it's a head teacher thing. Would you mind?
I can, yes.
Okay. This is our best way to say thank you to you, Alison. What we're going to do now is show you what we've gained from listening to you here. So Ludo's going to drop a link in the chat, just like we did yesterday. If you open that, Ludo will share screen as well, but don't try to type into the share screen because that doesn't work. The question will be, Ludo, what are your key takeaways from Alison's keynote speech at the Love Tutoring Festival? I have to tell you, I've got tears in my eyes, not only because of Miles, but because that quote from Chaim Ginot that you just said at the end, Alison, is foundational in my thinking. And it's always been the core of Qualified Tutor, that specific quote. So thank you.
So
Okay.
in the last 5 or 6 minutes, if you click that link in the chat box, it'll take you to a page very similar to this. What you're seeing on my screen is my screen, so don't try and type into here, as Julia said. But as I refresh this, and as the answers come in, we will begin to see some of the key takeaways from this wonderful keynote. Miles, that's a brilliant one.
Because it's miles away from his name. I'm going to video this because I love how they pop up.
And what often happens, you can never quite tell, but what often happens is that towards the end, one simple idea comes to the fore. Yesterday, it was authenticity in Alex Asher's masterclass session.
On sunshine. Oh, caring. Oh, there you go.
And there it is. So thank you for contributing those answers. And thank you, Dame Alison, for taking the time to deliver that and to deliver such a message to tutors. There were several in there, but the one that you've ended with was the most poignant. And thank you as well for finishing with a little bit of time to go, which doesn't always happen so far in the Love Tutoring Festival. So a very warm welcome, a very warm thank you, sorry, from us.
Thank you very much, and good luck, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Well,
Bye.
thank you.
Bye. Bye, Alison. Bye.